Golden Age stars with the worst baldness might not be the first thing you think of when remembering Hollywood's most iconic legends, but behind the glamour and studio magic, many leading men were quietly losing the hair battle. From cleverly hidden toupees to full-on bald bravado, these stars did whatever it took to keep up appearances. In this video, we're exposing the truth behind the camera, the most shocking cases of hair loss in classic Hollywood, and how far some went to cover it up. Sean Connery, the original James Bond and a global cinematic icon,
James Bond,
wasn't just known for his commanding presence and rugged charm. He was also one of the most famously balding men in Hollywood history. While fans remember his confident swagger and unmistakable voice, few realize that Connery began losing his hair in his early 20s. By the time he landed the role of 007 in Drive No at age 32, he was already relying on toupees to keep Bond's look intact. The studio worked hard to preserve the illusion. Every Bond film from Dr. No to Diamonds are forever featured Connery in carefully styled hairpieces that gave him the appearance of a full head of hair. Makeup teams and cinematographers were meticulous in their lighting and camera angles, making sure audiences never suspected a thing. And it worked, at least for a while. But unlike many of his peers, Connery didn't cling to the charade off-screen. As he aged out of the Bond franchise, he embraced his baldness, ultimately turning it into a signature part of his identity. In films like The Untouchables and Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, he appeared proudly bald, and still every bit the leading man. Sean Connery proved that charisma trumps hairlines, and that confidence, not follicles, makes a true star. Humphrey Bogart, the king of film noir and the face of Hollywood cool, was as iconic for his cynical charm as he was for his trench coat and ever-present cigarette. But beneath the fedora and brooding stare was a reality he shared with many leading men of his era: significant hair loss. Bogart began balding early in his career, and by the time he became a box office powerhouse with films like Casablanca and The Maltese Falcon, his natural hair was already thinning beyond recovery. Studios spared no effort in managing his on-screen image. Bogart wore carefully crafted toupees in nearly all of his major roles, and stylists became masters at disguising the recession of his hairline. His hairpieces were subtle but necessary. Without them, the tough guy image might have felt just a little less indestructible to 1940s audiences. Despite the illusion, Bogart wasn't especially secretive or embarrassed about his baldness behind the scenes. He joked about it with colleagues and seemed to understand that his appeal rested more in his attitude and delivery than in his hairstyle. In fact, it may have been that combination of vulnerability and grit that made him so enduring. Even with the wig work and studio polish, Bogart never tried to pretend he was perfect. He just made imperfection look iconic. Fred Astaire, the effortlessly elegant dancer who seemed to float across the screen, was the very definition of grace and sophistication in Hollywood's golden age. But while his footwork was flawless, his hairline told a different story. Astaire began losing his hair relatively early in his career, and by the 1940s, the thinning was obvious, at least without the help of movie magic. Off-screen, he was candid about it. On-screen, however, his hair was another part of the carefully constructed illusion. Astaire's signature style included a polished hairpiece that moved as gracefully as he did. Costume designers, directors, and lighting crews all worked in tandem to maintain the illusion of a full head of hair, because in the mid-20th century, baldness in a romantic leading man was considered box office poison. The toupees became part of his costume, just as essential as his tails and tap shoes. What's remarkable is how little it mattered to audiences. Whether dancing with Ginger Rogers or solo in dazzling musical numbers, Astaire's hair was never the focus. His presence, charm, and physical precision captured the spotlight. Even as he aged and his hairpieces became more obvious, audiences remained loyal. Like the true professional he was, Astaire used every tool available, including a wig, to deliver perfection. And in classic Hollywood, that was just part of the job. Clark Gable, famously dubbed the King of Hollywood, was the ultimate leading man of the 1930s and 40s, rugged, charismatic, and seemingly larger than life. But even kings have their vulnerabilities, and for Gable, one of them was his hairline. Despite his smoldering gaze and iconic mustache, Gable began losing his hair in his early 30s, right in the middle of his rise to stardom. Rather than let it dent his image, the studios stepped in with the go-to solution of the time, a custom-fitted toupee. By the time he starred in Gone with the Wind, Gable's hairpiece was as much a part of his costume as Rhett Butler's cravat. Studio technicians worked tirelessly to ensure the piece looked seamless, every strand carefully styled, every angle tightly controlled. His hair never looked overly thick or dramatic, which made the illusion all the more convincing to audiences. What makes Gable's case particularly interesting is how little his baldness seemed to affect his appeal. He wasn't cast for boyish charm. He had a mature, masculine energy that didn't depend on youth or vanity. In fact, the toupee wasn't a crutch. It was a silent tool that allowed him to focus on the role, not the image. Gable didn't chase perfection. He embodied presence, and that's what made him timeless. Yul Brynner, the unmistakable star of The King and I and The Ten Commandments, was one of the few Golden Age actors who didn't just accept his baldness, he turned it into a trademark. While many of his contemporaries scrambled to cover receding hairlines with wigs and clever lighting, Brynner went the opposite route. He shaved his head entirely, and did it long before it was fashionable. In an era where a full head of hair was still seen as a requirement for leading men, his bold look was nothing short of revolutionary. Brynner initially shaved his head for the role of King Mongkut in the stage version of The King and I in the early 1950s. The character called for it, and Brynner found that the look not only suited him, it made him stand out. When the film version was made, he kept the shaved head, and audiences loved it. His gleaming dome became a symbol of power, authority, and sensuality, something no one would have expected from a bald man in that era. What's remarkable is how Brynner turned a perceived flaw into a defining strength. He wasn't hiding hair loss, he was owning it. His commanding voice, intense gaze, and lean physique made his bald look feel regal rather than vulnerable. By embracing what others might have covered, Yul Brynner carved out a unique place in Hollywood history and proved that confidence, not convention, is what creates lasting star power. Gene Kelly, the athletic heartthrob behind Singin' in the Rain and one of Hollywood's most electrifying performers, brought a raw, physical dynamism to musicals that had never been seen before. With his muscular build, charismatic smile, and boy-next-door energy, Kelly seemed the very image of vitality. But behind the dazzling choreography and movie star glow, he too struggled with a quietly advancing hairline, one that began to thin as he moved into his 40s. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Gene Kelly managed his hair loss discreetly. His toupees were well-made and tailored specifically to complement his active, physically demanding performances. Whether he was flipping off lampposts or dancing through dream ballets, there was no room for a wig to shift or slip. That meant hours in the chair with stylists and designers, ensuring his hairpiece could endure the sweat, movement, and scrutiny of the camera. What's noteworthy is how well Kelly navigated it all. His fans were watching him leap, spin, and charm his way across the screen, not inspecting his hairline. And that's the genius of Kelly's career. He never relied solely on appearance. His artistry, his ability to make technically complex routines feel spontaneous and joyful, was what captivated audiences. Like many Golden Age stars, Gene Kelly used every tool available to maintain the image. But his enduring legacy proves he never needed the hair to make magic happen. Robert Mitchum, the epitome of cool detachment and noir masculinity, built his stardom on a kind of effortless toughness. With his sleepy eyes, slow drawl, and don't-care attitude, Mitchum seemed like the kind of guy who didn't worry about appearances. But even the most unflappable stars weren't immune to the pressures of Hollywood, and Mitchum's hairline, which began to noticeably thin by the 1950s, was quietly managed with a combination of studio tricks and occasional hairpieces. Unlike actors who wore full toupees, Mitchum often relied on partial hair enhancements or careful styling to fill in the gaps. His characters typically didn't require a pristine look. He played criminals, drifters, private eyes, men who lived rough. So the goal wasn't to look perfect, but to avoid looking too aged or exposed under studio lights. The subtle approach worked. His slightly messy, wind-blown look became part of his rugged image, making his receding hairline almost invisible to the audience. Mitchum never made a big deal about it. True to form, he shrugged off most of Hollywood's vanity. He rarely discussed appearance, and if he ever felt self-conscious about his hair, he didn't let it show. In many ways, Mitchum's ability to maintain his status as a sex symbol, even with visible hair loss, spoke to his authenticity. He didn't sell a fantasy of perfection. He sold a version of masculinity that felt real, worn in, and completely magnetic. Burt Lancaster, the broad-shouldered, blue-eyed star of films like From Here to Eternity and Elmer Gantry, was the very image of athletic, all-American masculinity. With a background in circus acrobatics and a booming screen presence, Lancaster didn't need much help commanding attention. But even he wasn't exempt from Hollywood's obsession with youth and hair. As he aged into the 1950s and beyond, his once thick, wavy hair began to thin, especially along the crown and temples. Unlike some stars who depended on a toupee from an early age, Lancaster initially resisted. Early in his career, he allowed some of the thinning to show, especially in more grounded roles where a perfectly groomed image wasn't essential. But as he transitioned into older, more dignified characters, especially in films where he played authority figures or romantic leads, subtle hairpieces started making their way into his toolkit. These weren't elaborate wigs, but discreet enhancements designed to reinforce the image of a man still in his prime. Lancaster approached the issue pragmatically. He understood that appearance mattered in the studio system, but he also had enough range and charisma to carry a role even if the illusion wasn't flawless. In fact, his willingness to let some of the natural aging show may have helped him stay relevant longer than some of his more image-obsessed peers. Burt Lancaster didn't need perfect hair. He had presence, power, and talent that outlasted the vanity of the industry around him. Telly Savalas, best known as the lollipop-loving detective in Kojak, was one of the few classic Hollywood stars who didn't just embrace baldness. He owned it so completely, it became his brand. Long before it was fashionable, Savalas made his smooth scalp a signature look. But what many fans don't realize is that his journey to full-on bald icon wasn't entirely by choice. Savalas began balding early in his career, and instead of hiding it, he made a radical decision for the time: shave it all off. It wasn't just for convenience. He first went bald for a role as Pontius Pilate in The Greatest Story Ever Told, 1965, and quickly discovered that the look gave him a memorable, almost intimidating edge. Casting directors agreed. His bald head became part of his screen identity: cool, confident, no nonsense. By the time he took on the role of Lieutenant Theo Kojak, the look was so tied to his persona that it was practically inseparable from the character. What's remarkable about Savalas is how he transformed what was traditionally seen as a career obstacle into a weapon of charisma. He didn't hide behind toupees or clever styling. He leaned into his baldness, paired it with sharp suits, sunglasses, and swaggering attitude, and built an entire second act of his career on it. In an industry full of smoke and mirrors, Telly Savalas proved that authenticity, paired with confidence, can be more powerful than illusion. George Burns, the ever-charming comedian with the cigar and signature glasses, had one of the longest careers in show business, spanning vaudeville, radio, film, and television. But while his wit stayed razor-sharp well into his 90s, his hair didn't. Burns began losing his hair early in life, and for most of his career, he wore a wig that became as much a part of his on-stage uniform as his round spectacles and dry delivery. Unlike many stars who treated their hair loss like a tightly guarded secret, Burns was refreshingly open about it. His wigs weren't always subtle, and he didn't pretend they were natural. In fact, he often joked about them, on stage, in interviews, and in his many autobiographies. For Burns, the hairpiece wasn't about vanity, it was about maintaining the image that audiences expected. A performer through and through, he knew the importance of consistency in persona. What set George Burns apart was his ability to age on his own terms. He didn't fight time with desperation, he worked it into his act. By the time he made his late career comeback in films like Oh God! And going in style, he was in his 80s, still sharp, still wearing a wig, and still completely in control of the room. In a town obsessed with youth and illusion, Burns showed that you could grow old, wear a toupee, and still steal the spotlight, as long as you kept your sense of humor intact. Danny Kaye, the high-energy entertainer behind White Christmas and The Court Jester, was beloved for his rapid-fire comedy, musical talent, and rubber-faced expressions. On stage and screen, he was a whirlwind of movement and emotion, often playing lovable eccentrics or charming underdogs. But behind that boyish charm was a reality that many of his fans never noticed. Danny Kaye dealt with noticeable hair thinning for much of his career, particularly as he transitioned out of his youthful prime. Kaye's balding wasn't dramatic or sudden. It crept in gradually, making it easier for him and the studio stylists to mask it with clever combing, hairpieces, and camera tricks. In many of his later roles, subtle wigs were used to preserve his familiar screen image. The hairpieces weren't flashy or dramatic. They were designed to blend in and maintain continuity rather than reinvent his look. What makes Kaye's case interesting is how little the hair loss affected his on-screen identity. Unlike the brooding leading men of the era, Kaye's appeal was rooted in timing, personality, and sheer performance energy. He didn't need a square jaw or a perfect hairline to command attention. He just needed a spotlight and a script. And when the hair finally gave way to age, he adjusted his look gracefully, often embracing a more natural appearance in public appearances and interviews. Danny Kaye may have worn wigs, but his talent never needed dressing up. Ray Milland, the suave Welsh-born actor and Oscar winner for The Lost Weekend, was known for his sophistication, sharp features, and commanding voice. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, he played everything from romantic leads to troubled anti-heroes, often with an air of quiet intensity. But like many of his peers, Milland faced a challenge that Hollywood rarely forgave, a receding hairline that became more pronounced as he aged into the 1950s. Rather than fight it aggressively in his early career, Milland let the slow retreat of his hairline happen with subtle management. His hair was always neatly styled, and in his prime, his thinning wasn't too noticeable. But by the time he transitioned into older character roles, particularly in thrillers, horror films, and TV appearances, Milland began using discreet hairpieces to maintain a dignified, camera-ready look. He was never flashy about it, and there's little evidence he tried to hide it off-screen. Milland understood the expectations of the studio system, but he also evolved with the times. As roles shifted and he aged out of leading man status, he didn't cling to youth with desperation. Instead, he leaned into more mature characters, often allowing the audience to see a more weathered, realistic version of himself. Ray Milland's use of a toupee wasn't about vanity, it was about continuity. He played his parts with integrity, whether or not a few extra hairs came along for the ride. Zero Mostel, the larger-than-life star of The Producers and Fiddler on the Roof, was as unforgettable as his name. A true force of nature, Mostel wasn't just an actor. He was a volcanic presence who could command a room with a single glance or outburst. But while his energy and expression were limitless, his hair certainly wasn't. By the time he became a star on stage and screen in the 1960s, Mostel was already dealing with significant hair loss, and it quickly became part of his theatrical identity. Mostel didn't shy away from the issue. In fact, he leaned into it with the same boldness he brought to every role. Off-screen, he was balding, often completely on top. But on stage and in film, he frequently wore wigs, some subtle, some exaggerated, that suited the characters he played. Whether portraying the scheming Max Bialystock or the devout Telly, the hair was always part of the costume, designed to serve the story, not conceal reality. What set Mostel apart from his balding peers was that he didn't seem bound by Hollywood vanity. He wasn't trying to pass for a romantic lead. He was too busy embodying eccentric geniuses, tragic clowns, and cultural giants. The wigs weren't about fooling anyone. They were tools in his theatrical arsenal. And when the role called for it, he had no problem showing his real, balding self. Zero Mostel proved that character acting, not cosmetic illusion, is where real transformation happens. His hair may have gone, but his presence? Unforgettable. Charles Laughton, the masterful actor behind unforgettable performances in Mutiny on the Bounty and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, was never a conventional leading man. With his expressive face, commanding voice, and unmatched emotional range, Laughton built a career playing complex, often tortured characters. But behind the dramatic gravitas was a man who, like many in Golden Age Hollywood, dealt with thinning hair and an unpredictable hairline that became increasingly visible as his career progressed. Laughton never had the benefit, or burden, of being marketed as a heartthrob. This gave him some freedom to let his hairline recede without the pressure to maintain a youthful image. Still, when roles demanded a certain look, especially in period pieces or grand studio productions, wigs were part of the costume. Whether donning powdered aristocratic curls or monk-like tonsures, Laughton used hair as a theatrical element, not a personal vanity. What made Laughton unique was how little his hair, or lack of it, seemed to matter to his power on screen. He could terrify, charm, or break your heart, often in the same scene, without relying on traditional Hollywood looks. And off-screen, he seemed unconcerned with hiding the passage of time. His balding head often showed in interviews and appearances a reflection of his confidence in craft over appearance. Charles Laughton's career reminds us that in true acting, presence trumps presentation. His hair may have thinned, but his performances, layered, passionate, and utterly human, remain among the most memorable in classic cinema. Baldness may have been a quiet battle for many stars of Hollywood's golden age, but it never defined them. These actors rose above the era's vanity and expectations, proving that charisma, talent, and presence outshine any hairline. Whether they embraced baldness or found ways to conceal it, they each carved out a place in cinematic history, not because of how they looked, but because of how they made us feel. Their stories remind us that even legends had insecurities, but also the courage to perform, to lead, and to inspire, no matter what. In the end, the camera may have captured their faces, but it was their spirit that truly lit up the screen. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment sharing which star surprised you the most. We'll see you next time with more stories from behind the curtain of classic Hollywood.